This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/work. Shopify.com/work.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Patrick McGilligan. He is a biographer whose subjects are as diverse as Orson Welles, Clint Eastwood, Jack Nicholson, James Cagney, Mel Brooks, and many, many others. He is also an editor, and if you're interested in writing, I suggest you listen right to the end of the podcast because there's a little bit of a surprise for any writers out there and something that you might be interested in pursuing yourselves. Happy New Year, everybody, by the way. This is going to be the first podcast to go out in 2022. I hope that it will be as successful a year as last year was in terms of the podcast, at least. I know for a lot of people 2021 was not a particularly pleasant year with everything going on in the world. Let's hope 2022 is a little bit more successful, a little bit brighter in terms of everything going on. One piece of good news that I'd like to share with you and spread is that we were named, the Writers on Film podcast was named as one of the top 50 best podcasts of 2021 by Time Out magazine. This is wonderful, given that we've only been around for 6 months and given that we're in such good company, and number 19 as well. So as Paul Hardcastle would have said, 19 in a totally different and more tragic pop context, it has to be said. But to help us out and to continue our upward surge in popularity and critical acclaim, it would be great if you could subscribe if you haven't already, leave a review on a podcasting site, tell your friends, tell anybody who you might think is interested. But before you do any of that, and you can follow me on Twitter, Dr. John T, DRJONTY. But now, before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
Well, my two worst, it's happened more than once, but my two worst were, spending an afternoon with Jimmy Stewart and him taking me home after a lunch or something, and him, really I think he did this with a lot of other people, but, breaking down and weeping when reminiscing about this, that, and the other thing, spending a couple hours there and coming back and having nothing on tape and have to recreate the whole thing for a Sunday piece for the Boston Globe. So, yeah, that was probably the worst. But I was trained to recreate, so it was okay. I don't use a tape recorder much anymore.
No?
No, I mean, the truth is that, when I started 50 years ago, really, some people had never been tape recorded. Many people had never been interviewed. So nowadays, everybody is interviewed all the time. Everybody who's current, and most of the golden age and the older Hollywood generation have passed on. If I was Googling Timothy Chalamet and I finishing a book about Woody Allen, so I would come up with dozens and dozens of interviews with him, in which the other thing that happens is when people are active, they're more practiced and rehearsed, and they very rarely say anything out of school. Whereas 40 years ago, you'd go to see someone who hadn't been talked to for forever. Quite often I would go to talk to people and they'd say, "You're the first person that ever asked to talk to me."
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, remember, I did 5 books of interviews with screenwriters at a time when nobody was really talking to screenwriters either. So I did 5 books of interviews with screenwriters. So, when you went to see people like, W.R. Burnett or even Julius Epstein, you were one of very few people that had asked to tape record their reminiscences. And this was true even when you saw people, I would say second tier stars with no pejorative meant to second tier, like Joel McRae or somebody, they were unaccustomed to having someone sit there for several hours and seriously tape record them. But nowadays, everybody who's active is rehearsed and practiced and either careful about what they say or repetitious about what they say. The great, older generation has mostly passed. And there were very few people who, back when they were alive, of that generation, who didn't respond warmly to request, because they weren't often treated, at great length seriously with the kind of interview that you're doing for your podcast. It was either rare or unusual or unique for them to be approached. So I often heard that. I even heard that with people when I was doing my Altman book. These were much younger people who said, "Oh my gosh, no one's ever asked to interview me before,"
Right.
Because it was people behind the camera or behind the scenes, and some relative stars, who weren't stars on commercial terms.
How did you start working in sort of biography? Because that seems to be your main interest.
Yeah, well, I have to give you the Reader's Digest version because we could talk only about that. But I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. And at the University of Wisconsin, by the time I went to the university there was a group of older film critics and scholars who really knew a lot. Most of them had come from the East Coast and had seen everything on TV. And they started watching things in the archives, because they had the Warner Brothers archives and I think it's the Republic archives and RKO archives between roughly 1930 and early 1950s. And these were films that in the Midwest, in particular, you couldn't see anywhere. But even in New York, some of them were films that weren't shown on television, or many of them. And these people started watching these films around the clock. And at the same time, there were all these protests going on and riots and the 60s movements of various colors. And we were boycotting classes. I had a TA who allowed me to write a paper on Cagney rather than go to class. I'd never watched a Cagney movie or thought about it. I started out writing a paper comparing Cagney to Bogart and realized that was even stupider and more grandiose than what I could do in a limited amount of time on a term. Ended up writing a paper about Cagney, and the TA said, "This is pretty good. Have you ever thought of submitting it to the Velvet Light Trap," which was a journal on campus run by a lot of these older people, older by a couple of years. And some of them were graduate students. And I said, yes. And is there any money in that? And then when I took it to that editor, he said, "Oh, this is pretty good. Could you rewrite it?" And I said, "Okay," I rewrote it. And he said, when I turned it in and they published it, he said, "This is pretty good. Have you ever thought of turning it into a book?" And I said, "Well, is there any money in that?" "There's not, I can tell you." went to the bookstore and went to the film book section where I've never been before and wrote down the names of 5 publishers and editors and sent off laboriously typed, pitches with copy of the article. And 4 responded and said no. And one in London, Tantivy Press, run by Alan Isles, who was a great father of a lot of film books, said, well, if you can improve it and make it longer, and turned it into more of a biography and less of a studious, analytical thing, we publish it. So I had a contract and I was an undergraduate. So some of the graduate students envied me, and I assure you it was nothing to envy, because it was an oppressive burden and didn't get paid very much. But Cagney was a good subject. So that was while I was still in college.
Did you learn to love Cagney when you were, as you were writing it?
Yes. And, to this day, I have a strange love of Cagney as though he was my first girlfriend, He's pure as an actor in a way that most are not. He's complicated as a human being, politically, which for me is interesting, and personally. He reaches into all kinds of areas because he becomes a producer, and he becomes a producer with his family, and then he has a kind of rather tragic end. And you have to keep in mind that when I started my term paper, there was no book about Cagney. No such thing existed. So I was doing it a lot by watching the films and then working in the library, trying to find articles, that had been written. And it was all pretty ham-handed and amateurish, what I was doing. And, subsequently, he had kind of a reemergence. His autobiography came out. He got the first AFI award or the second or whichever one it was. And he started to come back into the public arena slightly because his doctor told him to be more active. And but I was doing it all, from scratch in a way that nowadays, I've gone back to, which is I started in libraries, then I moved out of libraries and said, screw libraries, and went to see people and, to a lesser extent, archives, not libraries. And now it's back into libraries and the internet and archives because the people no longer, if you were writing about Cagney today, you'd be stuck with archives.
Right.
and my book and other books, and then making sense of everything. And so that's more what I do today, how I started. You have to always conquer the library and the databases and the documents and the archives. And I didn't when I was writing the Cagney book. My most expensive thing I did was take a plane trip to Washington, D.C. and watch The Time of Your Life, which could never be shown because Cagney only had a 7-year contract with Saroyan, the writer, or he would take the rights back. So he did take the rights back. At that time, it could never be shown. And I thought that was, incredibly resourceful of me. And I did a few other resourceful things, like I got his Cold War Department of Defense documentaries via mail because nobody really wanted them. So they were glad to send them to me as long as I sent them back. And I got to see almost everything, but I didn't interview anyone. I had a couple of letters maybe, but I didn't interview anyone. So it was it's kind of an embarrassing book, but also I'm proud of it. And then several years later, the publisher, maybe like 6-7 years later, the publisher said they had a request for 1,000 books, I think from the AFI, and they only had 200 in stock. And could they have permission to reprint? And I said, well, as long as you're going to reprint, could I rewrite the book and put in interviews with all the people that I've met and talked to in the intervening time? So I did. I totally rewrote the book, incorporating much more interviews and research. And I think it's better.
Had you interviewed Cagney as well at that point?
No. To this very day, I have very few regrets about people I never met or interviewed, because mostly I met and interviewed everybody I tried to meet and interview. No, Cagney was always writing me letters saying, well, I'll be on Martha's Vineyard in August if you're there, but I'm not on Martha's Vineyard in August. In fact, once I was interviewing Bill Wellman in Osterville, Massachusetts, where he had his summer home, and the phone rang. We were all having brunch, and it was Cagney and Martha's Vineyard, who said, tell McGilligan to come over, but I wasn't leading the kind of life where I could do anything that someone said. So when he was in the mood, I wasn't there. I went to see Raoul Walsh and spent hours with him. And Raoul says, Jimmy was here yesterday.
Oh, God damn it. That's so irritating.
So I eventually became very good friends with his brother, and I met his sister. And to this day, I'm in touch with the niece who has all of the records for Cagney Productions. And I'm very fond of her and that branch of the family. And I have all these, kind of near misses with Jimmy, and complimentary letters about my book.
I was going to say, yeah, he must have, it being the first book and it being virgin territory, he must have appreciated that.
I don't know. He probably turned the pages, I'm that way. I don't read things about myself, and he probably didn't. But he did write me a very nice letter and say it was a job of work, which was, a John Fordian phrase of the era, meaning, it's the highest praise. Well, you did a professional job,
Right.
With what you had to work with. So, so I think of him as my, long lost first girlfriend. I think of him fondly. I still like, some of the movies enormously. The vehicles, I appreciate. There aren't many great Cagney films. There just are not as films, but there are many great Cagney performances. And so, I like them.
I like some of those very early. I was watching some very early 30s stuff that he was doing. Now the names are going to escape me, but quick fire sort of pre-code comedies that. He's
very alive to the moment. He doesn't date. His performances really don't date. The filming dates, and most of the early 30s films are very exciting for the performances and for the pre-code stuff. And, Public Enemy is a great film, but it also dates, and there's very few that don't date. And he himself is a kind of a dated, archaic character, really, even by the time he gets into film, his kind of person, no longer existed in the same way in America. So I find him he's still endlessly watchful, but I can't watch directors' bad films. They really, they bore me, but I can watch good actors' bad films because the actors are often very exciting, even when the script is terrible or the direction is pedestrian. And Cagney's problem, of course, he fought against it, which is one of the reasons why he was interesting to write about. He walked out on Warner Brothers like twice and was sued. And was very early in his career blackballed, for being a troublemaker. And he was walking out because he was making a lot of, routine programmers, in which he didn't have a lot of control and he didn't have a lot of say. And they were making a lot of money for the studio, and the material kind of made him sick. And yet he was a totally professional guy as an actor, strangely. Because he's not really trained professionally, but he acts professionally. He was a worker. I like actors who go to work, carrying their lunch bucket, like Jimmy Stewart was another, very, very hard-working guy, working hard on his persona, working hard on his craft, doing his best to be honest in a role. So those are pretty good films, but you have to get to the Yankee Doodle Dandy because it's just so extraordinary, and then a few films in the 40s, and then White Heat, and then maybe 1, 2, 3 to get really, really good films because they had good filmmakers behind them. But Cagney himself is always really good.
Fascinates me as well. Spielberg tells a story about how Kubrick sort of quotes Cagney as, "This is why you don't like the acting in The Shining, because you don't like James Cagney. He's not one of your favorite actors, and so you don't like that sort of style."
Yeah, well, I wrote a book about Jack Nicholson too, and
sure.
Jack to me is he's a great inheritor of Cagney's tradition. Cagney could be a very quiet performer. That's what The Time of Your Life is about. A guy who's quiet, whimsical, wry, philosophical. He could be that person. He wasn't as interesting that way, as you might argue, but it showed range and depth and scope, in his acting. Jack can be about Schmidt. very, very close to the bone, very, very quiet, very, very composed. And he does, several films like that in which he's magnificent, really. And he can explode, like in Batman or The Departed, or as the Joker in Batman, or in The Shining. He's both. He starts out, in that limited, minimal way that he's very, very good at. He did it for Rafelson and King of Marvin Gardens. He's very, very good at that. He's very good at restraint. Very good at it. He likes to blow up, and he's very good at blowing up. He does both in The Shining. Shining is a film that divides people on the performance, as much as anything else. I think it's great. And I usually think Jack is great. He has a really high batting average. And I think in films like The Departed, when he goes too far at the end, it's because Scorsese let him, and Scorsese shouldn't have. And maybe Jack was doing that to save a scene that he thought needed something, over the top, because he does that all during Witches of Eastwick, partly for that reason. The film needs help. I'm not sure The Departed needed that, but it was Scorsese's job to say stop or hold it down. And Jack listens to directors, good actors, great stars, listen to directors, and they follow a smart director's suggestions. And that's why John Wayne is a great, great actor at times, because he submitted himself, to very tyrannical directors, who nonetheless knew what they were doing. I mean, Henry Hathaway, Hawks, Ford, these were not, nice guys, on the set, patting him on the back saying, good job, John. And that's why he at times is a really great actor. Same with Jack. He put himself in front of Antonioni, Milos Forman, which is a completely different way of acting. Over and over again, he's very careful about who he chooses, as the stories of filming The Shining are torturous, the number of takes that Kubrick would demand. Jack knows that, and he submits. He submits. Chinatown, same. Polanski, very, very difficult, tyrannical director at times. And look what we get. So, and I find Cagney the same way, because he submitted himself to John Ford, to Billy Wilder, to Raoul Walsh up in the mountains, to arduous work, because he wanted better directors and better material. He knew the directors would give it. He had that temperament of knowing that the artist behind the camera is as important as the artist in front of the camera.
That thing with Jack as well, of that, what you're saying about the restraint, it's such a counterintuitive idea, because he's so famous for the explosions that that very few people notice his control that leads up to that.
Well, I didn't meet Cagney, but I met Jack several times, and right. Jack is very, very similar in person, which is you approach him cautiously to see which mood he is in. Right. Is he in the quiet, warm, contemplative, philosophical, kidding mood? Or is he brooding, about to get in your face, and yell at you about something? Sometimes it's the movie they're working on.
Right.
To be honest, an actor gets in a mood, and it's like, I was on the set of Taxi Driver overnight one night with De Niro and Scorsese, and De Palma stopped by with whoever he was working with at the time. It's like way overnight, like an overnight shoot. And, you were told not to go near Bobby De Niro.
Right.
Because that would be your death and the end of you. Whereas Scorsese, is like a chatty Cathy, and he come on over here, I'll show you what I'm doing. Come on over here. Now I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to do that. Now I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to do that. He doesn't get, his creativity doesn't get interrupted. He's thinking of some bigger picture, but De Niro's there thinking, I'm Travis Bickle,
Yeah.
And sometimes, and that's why Jack is so good at playing those kind of characters, because sometimes he's sitting there thinking, I'm Bobby Dupay, and he's just about to explode. And he has all of that wonderful range. And he does, I think about Schmidt as a brilliant film, and some films where he plays charming or quiet. He's really, really brilliant, because he has that comfortably within his range. For Cagney, he didn't get to express that very often. You see it a little bit in The Strawberry Blonde, where he's playing a romantic comedy with Olivia de Havilland, directed by Raoul Walsh. So again, a pretty good director on Warner Brothers terms. And but Cagney was never very, very romantic romantic and warm, fuzzy in that way. And yet it's a charming movie because he's giving it that. He's giving it his all, in that direction. And he's a professional and he's good at it. He's not deficient. He never got a chance to work on that side of himself. But Jack, who's a very incredibly shrewd actor, has constructed a career where he would do something really commercial and really, really easy for the audience to digest. And he would turn around and do something really, really artistic and really complicated and really hard for the audience to digest. So it's much more artistic. He was doing that deliberately from Easy Rider on. Cagney never had that power. I'm not sure he had that inclination. He certainly didn't have that ability to craft a career, the way Jack has. And, Jack had the advantage of coming after these people and learning from their mistakes, learning from that it's better to control your career as much as possible and to think as consciously as possible about what you're going to be doing 5 years from now.
Also, I mean, the independence that people like Cagney were fighting for and sort of won, but in a sort of poison chalice kind of way. Nicholson wasn't exactly gifted, but they were certainly standing on the shoulders of those people who've come before.
Absolutely. The studio era was gone in the way that it had controlled actors and artists before. By the time Jack came along, and they knew it, they were rebels. They were rebels, and they wanted to make independent films, and they wanted to make anti-commercial films and anti-Hollywood, go into a genre and blow up the genre. They want, their westerns, Ride the Whirlwind, or is it Ride in the Whirlwind, and the shooting. These are anti-westerns. They're really, really kind of brilliant, kind of riddlesome. And you're not sure what to make of them, but they're kind of great. And they wanted to do that and get it out of their system to some extent, so he could go back and do Going South, which is really sort of like a movie starring Gabby Hayes or something. But Jack is Gabby Hayes. Yeah, they're pretty good students of film. You see it even with Clint Eastwood, who's I would say to me certainly less cerebral and less of a range and scope as an actor. He gives his range and scope more or less to directing, and still even his directing pretty much suits his persona. But he studied. I mean, he knew. He came up through the end of the golden age of studio picture making and went through the studio system to an extent towards the end, and he learned from the mistakes, and he stood on the shoulders of their gains. It's just Cagney in that generation, and this holds true even for Hitchcock, who ultimately had tremendous creative autonomy and control, but only for a short time in his career at the end. They learned they're a new, younger, better, stronger generation in terms of their ability to control their careers, and they're more responsible for their careers. I don't think Cagney is responsible for Blonde to Crazy, a movie from whatever year it was, which is a pretty good movie. And what's good in it is him and Joan Blondell, and kind of like the
That's the one that I couldn't remember the name of earlier. Yeah,
it's a pretty good movie, but you can't blame it on Cagney, and But I think nowadays, if Tom Hanks makes a really bad movie or a junky movie, you can blame it on Tom Hanks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and I like and respect Tom Hanks tremendously, so I'm not using him as a pejorative example. But if Denzel Washington makes a bad movie, you can blame it on Denzel. He's got the power and the brains not to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And something had to have gone wrong. Now, that's not true of a lot of people, but it is true of many more people than in 1931 in Hollywood, and also people who have much more conscious understanding of how to make a movie, like Denzel and Tom Hanks do. So you sometimes want, they're pretty good. Their batting averages are fantastic. So I'm not saying anything bad about them. But if they were to make a bad movie, it would be largely their fault.
But I was reading your Nicholas Ray biography, and the same thing occurred to me about Humphrey Bogart, because Humphrey Bogart falls into, he's a jobbing actor for many, many years. Then sort of Casablanca, Maltese Falcon come along, and he becomes sort of a proper lead. But even when he has that power, and he makes Knock on Any Door with Nicholas Ray, and he wants to sort of create his own sort of project, he kind of has to make it into a Humphrey Bogart movie in order to make it. He's constrained by his, what the studio persona that he has.
Well, I told you I started out comparing Cagney to Bogart, but I also started out chronologically, as I always do, looking at their films. And Bogart is rather not good, in the 30s. He's not great. Whereas Cagney is almost instantly great. And Bogart makes a couple of important, interesting movies. So he's not totally, but it's not till the end of the 1930s and films like Roaring Twenties where he gets, compared, contrasted with Cagney, that he begins to emerge as the Bogart, that we know. By the time of Knock on Any Door, yes, he should have been wiser, I think, about a lot of things. But of course, that's around the time of the Blacklist, and he was incredibly unwise politically, and he did some very foolish things publicly at that time. And I don't know how good he was as a producer. I think he had sort of crony writers or writer friends. Now, some of them were pretty good, like John Huston, and those were pretty good. You couldn't really get a better writer friend than John Huston to write for you and direct for you. And I think really accepting for a moment the really, really great Bogart films of the early and mid 1940s, High Sierra and Maltese Falcon and all those, many, he's always good, sometimes great. And then his filmography after Knock on Any Door, which I don't think is a great film at all. And I don't even like the other one, In a Lonely Place. Yeah, I think they're I don't like them very much. They're just not my kind of cup of tea. But basically, he gets very good. And then his film choices and what he chooses to make all the way up to the time of his death become very adventurous, very interesting, not always great, but adventurous, interesting, good performances, great directors often. Sometimes they're secondary films by great directors, but he does hit a stride. He does hit a stride that Cagney had hit, maybe 10 years before. As a performer, he hits a stride. And as a producer, and I think he was producing, he needed a producing partner. They all need producing partners. And Cagney's producing partner was his brother, which limited him. And Bogart had a succession of producing partners, and some of them were really good. And most of them were writers, because these people can't write. Okay, Jack can write. Clint doesn't write. He needs a writer. So mostly they need a producing partner who's a writer, and then those people are of a varying degree of good or bad, or like not at their peak, or whatever, or it's a bad idea. But Bogart's pretty good after about 1947. He has about 9 or 10 good years before he dies of making very interesting movies. And sometimes, and his performance, like I said, is really, really good. He knows his persona, and maybe it's that he knows his persona and he likes to play with it, but going outside of it worried him. Going too far outside of it. I don't know. I'd have to think about it and look at it carefully. But in the case of both In a Lonely Place and Knock on Any Door, he's deferring heavily to Ray and to other people involved in the project, including, in the case of In a Lonely Place, Gloria Graham, who was somebody who had to be contended with, not as a creative force, but as an anarchic force in that production. And I think he was deferring. I think he does defer. Cagney defers too, but I think Cagney's 50s films, they should be great, because his performance skills are still excellent, but the films are not great. Bogart's better in the 50s. If I had gone backwards, started watching Bogart's last film and worked my way back to 1931 or something with Bogart, I might have written about Bogart.
Right.
Because his third act is very, very good. Cagney's third act is spotty, weak, interesting, always good performances, but he was frequently putting himself together with producer friends, who weren't great producers, actor friends like Robert Montgomery. He's in, Lesser Vehicles by John Ford. Did he have bad luck, or was he making bad choices? Boy, I don't know.
Tough. But that's interesting in terms of how you choose as well what subjects to look at with your books, because you've written so many books about so many important people, and they're so detailed in terms of their research. There's such a depth to them. How do you decide, okay, I'm gonna look at this person next, or that person?
Well, the honest answer, which is very disappointing, is that the only book that I decided to do all by myself without anybody saying, go ahead, I'll pay you for it, is Cagney.
Right.
And every other book is circled off a list by an editor. And sometimes names are put on the list by the editor and say, what do you think of this? And I say no. And I'm well known for saying no, like I said no to Kubrick. It's a big mistake because he sells really well. But I said, I don't get him, I don't really. So it's my list, but it gets added and subtracted to. And, like, for example, there was a point in which they said, okay, let's do Fritz Lang. And, Clint Eastwood and Barbra Streisand were on that list. I said, really? You can pay as much for Fritz Lang as you would for Barbra Streisand or Clint Eastwood? Because for me, it's a job. It's a job. And they said, yeah, the editor, the head of the company, it was St. Martin's Press at the time, was a big German film fan, and he loves Fritz Lang. I go, well, okay, because, all right. And I only knew a little bit more about Fritz Lang than my mother did. So I didn't know that I was going to be, catapulted into this world, which is, for book to book, or book against any book, Fritz Lang is the most action-packed and the most bizarre in terms of who the character is and what he does. And I didn't know that. I went to Austria where he was born and put a 3x5 card on the university bulletin board saying, can a researcher help me? And I went to Berlin for the first time and said, what do you got? And that's what I do. I started out very stupid, with everybody, but I wasn't saying to myself at all, boy, this will be great research and what a great topic this will be. The opposite is really what happens. You're kind of appalled by the mountain you've agreed to climb, and you're stuck with it, and I've many times, after starting a book or making the first trip on a book, phoned my editor or agent and said, please, can I switch to something else and quit? Because
Get me out of here.
Yeah, I started the Clint Eastwood book by having dinner with Richard Schickel, I think on his dime, in Los Angeles, who I had never met. And he was about 2/3 of the way through his authorized biography of Clint, and he did his best to impress me about what a great memory Clint has and what a great source he is about everything and what a wonderful, easy, great job he had doing Clint's book. And I have to say, I envied him, I sounded like a great job to me, and I went out and I went to a phone booth and I called my editor and I said, please, can I get out of this book? Because I didn't see that I could do at that time like an alternative book, a book that would be any different than The Guy Who Remembers Everything and is telling Richard Schickel. It wasn't that hard, as it turns out.
That book is amazing. I read that's the first of your books that I read, and it was one of those situations. I bought it in London. A London airport, and my flight was delayed by 4 hours. So it was just one of.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, what the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass f- So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Those brilliant situations where you just sit down and you can read practically half a book before you even get on the plane, so it's and it just had me. I love the way in that book you even you start off with almost like a Western with his family. He's sort of owning dry goods stores and the great grandparents and things like that. So there's a real line between, the cowboys he's going to play and the actual history of the West.
Yeah. And that had never been done and wasn't done in Schickel's book. And I stumbled on it again. I had no idea. And I stumbled on it. And then it struck me, yeah, this is the Western that later on we see played out fictionally in various movies that Clint makes. And it was it's great Americana, as Clint really is great Americana. I always say when I teach, that Clint is America's winner. He's the guy that wins always. Even if he loses, he wins, and he's like Trump, he stands up and he says, only I can do it. And then he twirls his guns and he says, a man's got to be a man's got to be a man, and man's got to, do it all alone. Poor man, he's got to ride into the town all alone and shoot everybody and then ride out without a scratch. And Jack is the loser, America's loser. He can't win. He loses everything, So at the end of Chinatown, he loses the woman he loves. He doesn't solve the case. Everything's a mess. That's Jack. He's the loser. And I prefer the loser, as a persona and as a theme and as a serious subject. But I didn't know any of this about Clint, because even though I thought about him a little bit, in my time, and I had interviewed him, I thought he was a shrewd, packager of himself, and he is. I didn't know very much. So many people I called, said, what, you're calling me about Clint? Does he know he's going to kill you for calling me, And I'd go, oh, well, no, I don't even, I just wanted to come and talk to you. Ted Post, the director, said, I can't believe you're going to talk to me about Clint. Does Clint know? I mean, he's not going to let you do that. And I said, well, I'm not doing it, with him. Okay, then come over. And then, his producer of like 10 or 13 films and childhood friend, he said to me, well, how do I know I can trust you? Because I have a lot to say. And I said, I don't know. Why don't you look to see if you like the cut of my jib? That's what I usually say to people. And he said, oh, come on over. Turns out he's a big sailor. And I'd use the cut of the jib. He said, so you sail? And I go, no. And then, I went to talk to the guy who wrote Any Which Way But Loose. He was living in a cabin, out in the wilds and of the valley. And he said to me, he returned a letter I sent to the Writers Guild, and he said, you're the first person that has ever asked to hear my side of the story. He said, if you want to come, I'll tell it to you, and that's dollar for dollar, probably Clint's most successful film. And then the sequel. And then this guy was basically sued out of existence in a way that I talk about in the book, because Clint does, he does sue people out of existence.
Another Trumpian
holiday. Yes, he tried to sue me out of existence too. So
I was going to ask about that because yeah, I mean, after the Schickel sort of authorized biography, your version certainly showed Feet of Clay.
Yeah, that would have been a good title.
I've got to repeat one of the stories that you tell in that for our listeners, which I think is a brilliant one, is when he's making Honky Tonk Man and he wants to keep the Cadillac because he's a great sort of, he's a little bit tight-fisted, let's say, and he takes a shine to the Cadillac. And so in the script, it's going to be beaten up and deteriorate throughout the film, but because he wants to keep it, it just stays gleaming new until the end.
Well, there's a lot of that in the book. He really had he pioneered a lot of sort of modern Hollywood, I would call it crap, like product placement. He was really keen on, and there's many scenes in his movies that start with the insignia of the car, which he's giving you a product placement for, so he can have cars in his life and for his crew and for his company, et cetera. And it was very normal in Hollywood now. It wasn't really happening to John Ford in quite the same way.
Right.
And, I talk about, especially when you get around to the Monkey movies, he's always been a very, very shrewd marketer of his own image and his films. And he pioneered block booking, and mass, dumping as many of his films into theater, dumping his film into as many theaters as possible. He pioneered that, in the mid to late 1970s. And this is also something that everybody does now. And is a terrible thing because it crowds other films out of theaters. So in many ways, I find him to be the embodiment of Hollywood, whereas Jack's nickname is Mr. Hollywood. He's the embodiment of the other side of Hollywood, this little sliver of artistic integrity and cool and hip. and with it. Clint is the embodiment really of America. I mean, it's really about making money and selling, and this whole life reduced to this simple theme of a man's got to do what a man's got to do, which I find just to say it, or only I can fix it, just to say it reduces it to its superficiality. If Jack stood up and said, I'm going to go out with my gun right now and solve all this, everybody in the audience would snicker. But when Clint does it, everybody feels tremendous relief and pride, that we've got this guy who's even better than John Wayne and, can ride the horse. And no matter how old he is, and even if he dies in the film, somehow he's redeemed by his behavior to an immigrant boy or whatever. He's always making himself good and saintly, regardless of what shitty thing happens in the movie. Jack doesn't do that. He doesn't go like, I'm really a great detective in this movie, or I'm homeless, but I'm really great, an ironweed. I'm really a good man. No, he's not a good man. He's a human being. He's very flawed and screwed up, and possibly somebody who should be avoided because he's like pathological. And he enjoys playing pathology and America's losers and misfits. And Clint plays the Western hero.
I wonder what Jack Nicholson's Dirty Harry would be like. Because I can imagine him playing that in that film. I can imagine that. But it wouldn't be, as you say, it wouldn't be that throwing the badge in the water at the end wouldn't be like a defiant and then turning up for the sequels.
I think those kind of movies came to Jack. I think they're too stupid.
Right.
Jack is a smart guy, and his movies are pretty smart. By the way, I love Dirty Harry. It's a really good movie. Is it fascist and stupid at times? Yes. But it's very shrewdly done to pull you along. It has such a creepy villain that you don't care how that villain is taken care of. By the way, probably the best villain, that Clint ever had, and that's a long time before you get another good one. But it's a very, Don Siegel's very cleverly written, is very cleverly cast, very beautifully shot. Clint has always looked like a slightly taller, manlier Rock Hudson. And so he never looks handsomer than in that movie. And so it's a very appealing movie, but I think it's also stupid and offensive. It gets reduced to a guy jumping on a bus full of screaming school children and then like shooting the guy, daring the guy to go for his gun and then shooting him and then throwing his star away. It's clever, but I think it's stupid. And Jack would have said, he makes a movie like that, Jack does, The Border.
Oh, of course, yeah, with an English director, I think.
Yeah, Tony Richardson.
Right.
Yeah. And it's the Dirty Harry, because Jack can't win and he can't succeed, so that's not going to happen in the same way. He's going to be but Clint puts in things because he's shrewd, that makes him sympathetic. Even in Dirty Harry, like he has his dead wife. He's a lonely man. He's always a lonely man. He's up against the bureaucracy, which consists of the law and judges who quote the law to him and stupid officials. This is a very populist approach that people like this. I'd be the last person to say that the law is always good and the judges are always good, but it's always contrived in such a way that it's simplistic.
Yeah, I mean, not just shooting people first. It doesn't seem to be
shooting people first.
Doesn't seem to be working for America at the moment. Put it that way.
Like the bank robbery hot dog scene, which is a spectacularly good scene as filmed. And we were talking about how Cagney made movies in which he was brilliant, but the films were really not very cinematic or very good, really, as films. Well, Dirty Harry's really great as a film, even though at times what's going on the screen is completely stupid. Here's a guy, he's having a hot dog, and he says, oh, what's going on across the street? Oh, darn, now I'm going to have to interrupt my lunch and go across the street. Shooting like an Unforgiven, where he goes into the saloon and shoots everybody, and they all shoot at him, and everybody shot, they all die, and he walks out, and he's not. In Dirty Harry, I think he has some ketchup on his side. Well, it turns out to be a nick. A nick, and it's a totally brilliant scene. But come on, these scenes like this have contributed so much to our deterioration of our culture and gun culture, and
I love the bit in Zodiac when Mark Ruffalo comes out of a screening of Dirty Harry and says, "Oh, he shoots him in the end." It's just like they're desperately trying to find this serial killer, and they'll never find them in reality. But in the film, he shoots him. It's fine.
Yeah, and another problem with Dirty Harry, which again I say really is a rare Clint Eastwood film I really enjoy and like, even though I hate it in some ways. The real problem is that he then goes on to make Dirty Harry, over and over and over and over and over and over and over again in different ways. He draws on that forever. That's his wellspring. That's his wellspring, that and Leone. And I like Leone because Leone never pretends to be real. Leone is a cartoon. He's a graphic novel, and he's never pretends to be real. There's no reality. There's no pretense to reality. Clint always pretends to be real, and this is real life. And he sees himself that way, as making a commentary on real life. So the Westerns are real, and the contemporary films are really about real. And later on in his career, when he becomes a director, he starts making like biopics and dramas about real life events. So he goes even further into, these become even more ludicrous, like the J. Edgar one. Not uninteresting and not completely terrible. And some of them are like pretty good, but they're best when like in Letters from Iwo Jima, when he can't understand what the actors are saying. And he doesn't project himself into the film, and that's a pretty good film too. As a director, he knows where to point the camera, and he has a lot of discipline as a filmmaker, which amounts really to not discipline of like what shot to include, but like start, finish, and make the next film after that, which Jack was incapable of doing.
Sure.
Proved himself incapable of making more than 3 films because it becomes consuming for him and becomes crazy for him. And Clint is methodical.
Talking about directors, you've split your work between filmmakers like Hitchcock and Fritz Lang, and then also actor directors like Eastwood and Mel Brooks. Does it become difficult, that sort of, do you change approaches at all for when you're looking at those different categories?
Well, also, I would add also screenwriters, because there's 5 books, and then Tender Comrades, which is about the blacklist. And these are all separate categories really of thinking. Well, remember, I said to you, and it's the honest truth, things are circled off a list.
Right.
So other things are on the list that I never get to write about, and including people will say to me sometimes, why isn't there a woman subject for a biography article? Because, my stupid editor said to me, Barbra Streisand, she doesn't really turn me on. And I go, well, she doesn't turn me on either, but that's not really what we're discussing, is it?
Right.
That was like 20 or 30 years ago. It'd be a very bad idea for a book now. But I don't care as much as you think. There sometimes when a director has made many, 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 many movies, like Hitchcock did, let's say, okay, and Woody Allen, I just finished a book about him. It becomes a very difficult job of storytelling because it's boring. Then he made this movie, then he made that movie, then he made this movie. Actors tend to, and Hitchcock had a relatively modest private life. Woody Allen does not, as we know, but he's also an actor, and so is Clint, and they have personal lives that are messy and that show up in their films in various ways. Hitchcock was much more of I like to do this kind of story, and then I'm going to do it, and then the next one. So it's a problem as a writer to write an 800-page book about Hitchcock and keep up a narrative drive.
Right.
That isn't, and then he made his next film. And it's the same problem with Woody Allen, because even though he has a messy private life, that messy private life only shows up in various ways. And it doesn't, some of the films are completely, apparently, unaffected by that. And you can't keep writing about, you can't say over and over again that Hitchcock put his obsession with blondes into his next movie, because the third time you say it, it's repetitious and boring. And you have the same problem with people who are very prolific and have done a lot of work, whether it's Clint Eastwood or Hitchcock or Woody Allen. And the trick is to find a way to tell the story that will take care of all the movies and treat the movies with relative equalness, and give them their proper weight and their proper balance without boring readers, including people who know that movie backwards and forwards. And it's a real problem, and it's sometimes a problem made easier by messy lives. Which I don't want to say actors have messier lives, because who has a messier life than Fritz Lang, or Woody or Clint, but Fritz was just a director. He wasn't in his movies, and his life was incredibly messy and exciting to write about. And it alleviates, in the case of Fritz Lang, a lot of bad movies. Because I don't love his movies, and I didn't choose to write about him because I love his movies. There's 1, 2, or 3 that I really love, and that's enough. It shows there are 1, 2, or 3 that are genius.
Right.
And then people can argue about which 1 or 2 or 3 it is, but most people won't disagree about Metropolis, and they won't disagree about M. So his exciting life, and writing about him as a person and as a character, and as his themes and obsessions as a person and as a character, alleviate many of the bad films that come along that you're stuck writing about. But if you have a relatively bookwormish life, like Hitchcock or Woody Allen, it becomes a problem. It's a problem for the writer to figure out how to do it. Now, I kind of like those problems, but I only like them when they're solved.
In retrospect.
Yeah, I mean, I like the challenge of them, but they're best solved, and they're really never solved till you're done working, and then you're stuck with whatever you did, and then they're solved. But they get solved along the way in various ways. But when somebody, for example, Mel Brooks, he directed like 12 or 13 movies. Bless him.
How many are good?
And that's part of the story. But it was a different structure, because he got done making movies in like whatever it is, 1992 or something. And then he has 30 years left, and he's still alive. And you have to find like an act 3 that makes some sense and is good, But you only had to write about 13 movies, or however many there are. And then his many, many other little appearances, most of which are inconsequential. Some movies, so like when he remakes To Be or Not to Be, there's something to write about, because you can compare it to Lubitsch, and you can talk about the differences. And then there are some memoirs of like what happened on the set, which are fascinating. And then there's a lot to write about. But what do you write about even when you get to, I don't know, History of the World Part 1, which is, mostly a terrible movie. There's not a lot I was on the set of that movie. It's mostly not a good movie. And you said how many of them are great? Well, only one is great.
Young Frankenstein.
And you can argue about which one it is, but I think it's Blazing Saddles, or some people would say.
Okay, I'd say Young Frankenstein.
Blazing Saddles would be one of my 10 favorite post-60s American movies, period. And I think it's a great movie. Okay. But it says a lot to me. I like the movie. It talks to me. Young Frankenstein I find quaint and amusing and beautifully pictorialized, and the producers I find to be, the performers are great. The material is interesting. It's kind of a one note. And so I don't get too excited. I like Spaceballs, because it speaks to me. And I think he had very little understanding or appreciation for the genre. So he just like went full out, let's just film the fart, and that's what he's sometimes good at. So I kind of like it. But as films, there are very few that are very good. But I say, great, because I don't have to write about 50 films. I can write about 13. That's really nice. I did this whole maybe it's 600 to 800 page book about Orson Welles, and it all ends before Citizen Kane. And people say, is that the hardest book he ever wrote? No, it's the easiest, because I didn't have to deal with analyzing the films at all. And I didn't. I sneaked them in various ways. And then I had a sort of postscript where I covered everything. But I didn't have to write a single line of film analysis or description, or deal with, people will say to me, what do you think of, Mr. Arcaden, or what do you think of the cutting of The Other Side of the Wind? And I go, I don't know.
It's just it's in your postscript where you just say, and he made some films.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to think about them. I might have a personal opinion, but I might not. I don't care. I really care about what I get paid to do, and then I'm not outside of that box. I have opinions like a normal person, but I don't sit around worrying about what's happening to the uncut version of the Don Quixote film or something.
Right.
I don't think about it at all.
I think that's quite a refreshing way of doing film criticism as well. It's just like, I'll do whatever's in my reading.
And there is no film criticism in my book about Orson Welles. I don't think there's any film criticism. There is. I do take a position on like, what did Herman Mankiewicz do? But that's not a film critic's opinion, really. It's the opinion of a journalist. So, when that movie came out, what is that stupid David Fincher movie called?
Mank.
Yeah, when Mank came out, people said, "What do you think about it?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I guess I should go see it. I really don't want to, but I guess I should because it does all take place before, or most of it before Citizen Kane. So it is in my remit, And I felt like I should see it, and it was it's pretty stupid. I mean, the acting is good, and it's great cinematography and decor, perhaps interesting choices they made, and pretty stupid. I mean, not a very, this is not a point of view that I would adopt, but I feel the same way about the movie about Hitchcock. Both of which, from my point of view, crib from my books, and the Hitchcock one in particular cribs very strongly from my book, which has things in it that no one ever had or knew about Hitchcock. And the real problem with the movie is that it's stupid. Not that it's a bad idea for a movie, or that Anthony Hopkins is bad. He's not good, but he's not bad. He certainly gives it a try. It's just that the conceits they adopt and use and then present as real are ludicrous from a film historian's point of view. So, and I would say both about Mank and about Hitchcock. Is that what that movie's called, Mank?
Mank, yeah, it's Mank.
I would say about both of those that if they told the real story, the truth, it would be compelling. Like rather than soap opera everything up and make everything melodramatic, which they did in both cases, and create sort of lurid ideas, inside this thing. If they tried to tell a documentary drama kind of truth about both situations, Hitchcock's real nature and Mankiewicz, they'd have a great movie. So to me, they just made bad decisions.
I think those Hollywood-based sort of biopics, or Saving Mr. Banks, reminds me of this. They always have to have the different forces somehow coalescing, and sort of in the end they're kind of friends. And they always have a sort of Freudian, Freud lives on in Hollywood movies to an extent that is unreal, in terms of, that's why he turned out to be like that. I see. It was the mum, was it?
Yeah. Well, no, I think it really, yes. And, that's probably a commercial imperative, because they're all commercial imperatives. But every once in a while, I didn't see Saving Mr. Banks. I heard it was good. Is it not good?
It's an advert for Disney. This cantankerous creative type doesn't want Disney to touch her thing, and then Disney makes a wonderful film, and she's in the cinema and realizes, well, actually, it's quite good.
Well, I'm not really saying that films must be realistic or true, because here I praise Yankee Doodle Dandy. It's a totally wonderful movie. It's completely stupid as history. It's false as a history and as a biopic, as I wrote about in my book, and as I've continued to believe. But that doesn't stop it from being a really great movie. But in the case of Mank and Hitchcock, they not only made it ludicrous and unreal, but they made it stupid and commercial in ways that really aren't good. That, as you say, taking simplistic explanations and using that as your whole basis of thought for what the movie is. Like this idea that Mankiewicz was somehow had his reputation and fame stolen by Orson Welles on Citizen Kane, and that he was some kind of really jolly guy, that funny guy that is less interesting than an honestly dramatized account of his career, even if you put in song and dance numbers and made it really exciting to watch. So they make commercial decisions, that I think are bad ones, but it's not always bad to make commercial decisions. I haven't seen, West Side Story yet. I mean, there are people that are very good at making commercial decisions, and Spielberg has got a pretty good track record, and he's pretty good at it. And then there are people that are bad at it, are not good at it, And I just think that in both cases, they were looking for they're looking for Oscars, which are not that hard to get, and nominations, which are not that hard to get. And the unfortunately, the history of Oscars is rich with films that nobody wants to watch anymore.
Right.
Because they really aren't very good. And in David Fincher's case, he was honoring his father, which I think is cool. That was the job. And so he did that. In the case of Hitchcock, they thought they putting in all this, sort of woke stuff and feminist stuff and making Mrs. Hitchcock more important than she was, and she was very important, that this would somehow, create a stir of excitement among the crowd and stuff. So I don't know whether it was calculated and conscious or just dumb.
I'm really curious to know how you're dealing with Woody Allen, and how, given his situation, how his name is kind of on the list still.
Yes. Well, I have to watch myself and reply, but it's complicated. He's a very, very complicated character who mostly shows himself in his films and then an occasional public behavior that you have to either judge or report on. And he wasn't on my list, meaning I wasn't thinking about him, even though I've always liked his films, and I totally respect his career. And some of it is great. And a surprising percentage of it is good, and I admire anybody in their 80s who's still making movies and is working. That's pretty good, However, yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem. How do I deal with the whole Mia Farrow thing and not make it not the whole book? Right. How do I judge that? And does anybody want to read? Now, the answer is, and this is maybe broadening it out nicely before we close, the answer is, strangely, people don't read my books very much anyway in America. They don't. I mean, It's amazing. It's amazing when someone says to me, everybody I have ever met has read my Altman book. I go, really? I sold like 700 copies or something. In America, it's an okay market if you get a lot of attention and you get a lot of reviews and people follow your work, and the publisher is happy about that, because publishers have a lot to do and they like to get a little reception back. They like to get a good reaction back, and they like to do things they're proud of, regardless of sales, sometimes kind of like Hollywood in the old days, But I really make half my money and half my earnings in the long run, and that's overseas, and that's if a book lasts and it stays around. So I didn't make any money on Alfred Hitchcock for 10 years, and literally no money for 10 years. And the reason why is because they paid me too much to do it.
Right.
I knew it at the time, but I'm not going to complain. So they didn't pay me any more than a beginning school teacher. I mean, I wasn't well paid, but they paid me too much because those books are not worth that much. But over time, the book has come to be seen as everybody's number one book to cover as much as possible about Hitchcock in a sensible and interesting way. And now I make a lot of money off of the book every year. And so do they. So, so I don't think about Woody Allen about who's going to buy it in America, because his own book sold very poorly. But I think of 30 or 40 years from now, after I'm dead, will that book still have value? And the answer is, I think it will. And I think it will sell in foreign countries. And, there's always, for some books, like I did a book about Oscar Micheaux, who never made a Hollywood film and was a Black filmmaker in the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, and had a very difficult struggle of a career, and yet was a very, very interesting person. And everybody who I was proposed to making that book to, and I proposed for a long time, they said, who's he? How do you pronounce his name? How do you spell it? Wait, and my agent said, Pat, you're not. And I said, are you sure, Gloria? And she's great. So I'm just saying, I encountered nothing but resistance. The only way I got to make the book was by saying, okay, I'll do the Nick Ray book, and then I'll do this other book about Oscar Micheaux, and we'll do a double book deal, and you can pay me very little money. And but always part of the pitch was, because they would say, well, you don't have very many Black readers. And I go, yeah, I want Black readers. Let's have Black readers. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do here. Broaden my audience. And but always part of the pitch was, this is a great movie subject. And Tyler Perry is developing it into a movie, and has been developing it into a movie for several years. And I think it's going to happen. And that's something that when I'm doing a book, sometimes those kinds of markets or those kind of considerations are more important to me than how many people are going to read the book in hardcover in its first year of existence in the US, which is something I wish a lot of people would buy it and read it in hardcover in the first year in the US, which is the year that means the most to the publisher too. But it just really often does not happen in my case. And some of my most treasured books have sold the least, and never, like Tender Comrades has never made $1 that I know of.
Right.
Not $1.
Right.
I think our advance was $5,000 split between the two of us. Actually, I think I took the advance and went to Greece and interviewed Jules Stassen and told my collaborator, because I was the senior partner, that he could have the first money back out of the royalties. But there have never been any royalties.
Right.
So is it a less good book? No. It's probably my favorite book. The same with Backstory. Almost no money. There's 5 books there. Almost. Some of my books are most famous. Robert Altman has never made any money. I get royalty statements saying I owe the publisher. It was published in 1985 or something. They still have it. It's out of date. It's out of date because it ends, before he comes back and has the third act of his career. It's indispensable if you care about Robert Altman. It's a really, really great job, and everybody knows it who cares about Robert Altman. But it's a very small number of people who care enough to buy and read a book. I'm judging by my royalties, and that has never sold a foreign right. And do I care? Well, yeah, I'd rather it sell and I get some royalties. But do I really care? No, I'm past it. I'm beyond it. There was a time, maybe about 10 years ago or 15 years ago, where I thought, well, maybe I'll make a living. But I don't. Right. I barely do, and I don't care anymore. I take the long view, which is that in the long run, the book is still valuable and good.
Yeah, and look, this podcast is definitely going to get some of those book sale numbers shooting through the roof.
Well, let me ask you what you do when you're not doing this terrible free thing that you're doing.
I write, yeah. You do a lot of criticism.
Okay, well, I'm going to say this to anybody listening to the podcast, but I'm really going to say it especially to you.
Okay.
I am the editor of 2 book series in America. And one is at the University of Wisconsin Press, which doesn't do very many film books, and they tend to do erudite ones that you've never heard of. And when I say they don't do very many, if they do 1 or 2 a year, that's a lot for them. But I also do the series editor at the University of Kentucky Press, and we do lots of film books. We have an open door and an open mind to subjects. We try to do books. We're not interested in scholarly books per se, because there's really no market and people don't read them. So we try to broaden it out and make it as popular as possible. But to you, I say, is there something you want to write about? Why don't you write a book for the University of Kentucky Press and submit a proposal? And to anybody listening to this podcast, I say the same thing. I will only try to talk you out of it by saying it's not much of a living, and it's a struggle. And
I got that. I got that message loud and clear.
Good. The key is to love your own book. And if you love your book, I can get up every morning, look at a copy of a book I wrote 30 years ago, and feel a real jolt of happiness and pride. I get things sent to me from around the world. So-and-so's bookshelf, look. So-and-so's bookstore, look. So-and-so, this book was mentioned in the such and such. Someone sent me something the other day saying, Cagney, we have a Facebook group that are obsessed with Cagney. Would you please join? We really love your book. I join. I'll probably never say anything, but you can't, a book that you like, that you've done as best job that you can on, and that it's forever, and it's a badge of pride forever, and a badge of joy forever. It's never, it's a millstone while you're writing it, and then afterwards, it's a badge of honor that you will love. So I leave you with that.
That's amazing, Pat. Thank you.
I look forward to your proposal.
I will send one. I will send one presently. Absolutely.
Yeah. Don't work hard on it till we talk, because honestly, you should do that, because it podcasts. Who knows what the future of them is? Will they be archived? Will they be watched after their time span is gone? I don't know. But books, you can't burn them all.
So that was me and Patrick talking on a whole range of subjects. Conversation really went to some very different places, and all entertaining and interesting. And a little bonus at the end, as I had promised, with Patrick offering an open invitation for anybody who wants to pitch a book idea to him. So hopefully some of you might take him up on that. Wouldn't it be great if someone got a book deal on the basis of this podcast, and then when the book was coming out, I got to interview them? Wouldn't that be interesting? Hell, it might even be me. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks to Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Howard for helping out with the art, and until next week, take care.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be.